Hi guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Uche Kennedy. If you're new here, welcome. It's been a while. Please make sure that you click the subscribe button down there, click the like button. And with that said, let's get into this video. In today's video, I'm going to share with you 4 common practices and 4 best practices. So there are a number of things that a lot of students preparing for the USMLE tend to do. There are certain practices that they tend to engage in that are actually detrimental to their studying, detrimental to long-term memorization or recalling of information. And then there are 4 other practices that are actually going to improve your score significantly and save you a lot of time as you prepare for the exam. The first is reading and rereading. So if you've been through med school, you know a lot of persons, and you probably do this yourself. You read your notes, and then you read them again. You attend class first, you read the notes, you watch videos, and then you watch the videos twice, and then you read your notes twice, and then you read the first aid probably twice or thrice. Now, a lot of students do this. Rereading is one of the least efficient ways to study. Rereading, again, is one of the least efficient methods of preparing for the exam. Why is this the case? Because when you reread information, you don't necessarily learn. When you reread information, you passively take in the same information. It's like watching a movie twice. You're not as curious because you know what is coming next. It doesn't mean that you have all this information in your head. It just means that your brain has a cue as to what the next set of information is, It's like when someone quotes a chapter in the Bible, for example. If you know the Bible, someone said, "For God so loved," everybody says the world. Because you know "for God so loved the world," it doesn't mean that you know the chapter where that is coming from. It doesn't mean you know the exact verse where that is coming from. It's just that when you hear the beginning part of the statement, you know automatically what the end part of the statement is going to be. Similarly, when you study a material, when you reread a material, it just makes you feel better, because when you read one line, you sort of know what the next line is going to be. You know, it's like when you've answered a question before and then you see the question again. It's not that you remember how to explain the concept, it's just that you've seen the question before. So when you see a few lines of the question, you know what the answer is supposed to be, even though you don't know how the answer is the way it is. What is the best way to do this? Instead of reading and rereading and losing time, the best way to approach this is to practice spaced repetition. Spaced repetition is a framework of study where you study something today. Let's say you study general pathology today, for example, and then 2 weeks down the line, 3 weeks down the line, you review general pathology. And then 6 months down the line, if you have that long to study, you review general pathology. Now, what is reviewing general pathology? You're not going back to study general pathology again. Usually, if you do an extensive study of a system like general pathology today, in the next 2 weeks, when you go back to it, it's probably to go and do about 10, 15 questions from general pathology, to do another 20 questions or 1 block of questions from general pathology. When I prepare students for the USMLE, what I tell them is, okay, if you're doing UWorld, practice 2 to 3 blocks of UWorld, general pathology, or 1 block general pathology. If you get a comfortable score, you move on. 2 weeks down the line, you can come back and do 1 more block of general pathology. Why is this important? Because it tests how much residual knowledge you have. A very common problem students have is that when you study today, after 2 weeks, 3 weeks, you forget a lot of the things you've studied because you've now moved on to 2 other systems, 3 other systems. To avoid this, when you do a system this week and you've done a number of questions, 2 weeks, 3 weeks down the line, pick up that system again, pick up a block of questions from that system and practice the questions and see what you get. At that point, you would not just be pouring out information you have memorized, you would be pouring out information you have internalized. So practicing spaced repetition is one of the most effective ways to actually study and prepare for the USMLE and actually improve your memory in the long run. The second thing people do is reading the first aid multiple times. A lot of persons will tell you, I did the first aid 5 times, I did the first aid 10 times, I did the first aid 3 times. Now, I could tell you that I think I have probably gone through the first aid over 20, 30 times. But none of those times was cover to cover. So if I'm having this class with this student, I'm referencing this part of the first aid or that part of the first aid. If I'm studying something for myself, I'm referencing this part of the first aid or that part of the first aid. But I have not sat down to read the book beginning to end, beginning to end, beginning to end. When you do that, you're not necessarily reading. All you're doing is passive memorization, and this is what a lot of students do. So you've read the first aid before, you've read it again, you've read it again. The same thing with UWorld. You've done UWorld before, you've done it again, you've done it again. Do you notice that despite doing these multiple readings, or even practicing UWorld questions multiple times, your scores have not necessarily improved? What you've noticed is you recognize the UWorld questions, you sort of know what is in the first aid, but your thinking has not changed. You've not been able, when you're given a fresh set of questions, you are still not able to answer them. The reason is because you've only practiced passive memorization. You've not actually actively engaged your brain in building analytical thinking abilities, or in building logical reasoning and the skills you need to actually figure out some of these questions that are not necessarily familiar. What should you do instead? Best practice: finish multiple question banks. If you have so much time in your exam preparation that you can finish the first aid 5 times, I would say do the first aid 1 time and finish another Q bank 4 times. So if you finish reading the first aid the first time, which I don't think is a reasonable exercise, but let's say you read it system by system, and after each system you practiced the questions on UWorld for those systems or whatever Q bank you're using. When you're done, instead of going to reread the first aid, it's much better to do a Q bank. As you do this Q bank, you reference the first aid to find information that you would need. That is great. You want to have the first aid as a body, as a side body that you work with. You always reference your first aid because at a point your first aid becomes very familiar to you. So you should actually reference your first aid a lot. What you should probably not do is read the first aid multiple times. It does not help you. It feels good for sure. It feels like you're doing a lot of work. And that's why a lot of students tell me, Kennedy, but I've worked so hard for this exam. I've done so much work. What have you been busy doing? Have you been busy repeating and rereading the first aid, or have you actually been doing perfect practice? Because perfect practice makes perfect, and perfect practice is to read the first aid 1 time or any video resource you have. Trust your brain to remember the information, because it will remember the information even if you don't believe that it will, and then finish multiple Q banks. Do multiple Q banks. The number of questions you practice are often correlated with the performance you make or you get on the USMLE. Very important. The third thing is highlighting with a paintbrush. Have you seen some people's first aid? It's like whoosh, yellow, green, blue, red, yellow, green, blue, green, indigo. There's all sort of highlights in this book. The first aid is a high yield resource. Now, even in the first aid, we can actually pick out much more high yield information from other information. But highlighting is another very poor or low efficient method of preparing for the exam. When you studied during med school, if you're in med school, you're in MD1, MD2, or even in pre-med, for example, you could highlight a few things because you need to pick out what is most important, especially if you're reading big textbooks like the Robbins, Harrison's. If you're reading any of these big books, you may need to highlight a few passages so that when you open the book, you easily reference them, because this is where certain important information you need is located. But what highlighting does oftentimes is take away the brain's need to remember information. What this means is this: if I know that whenever I come to this book, I'm going to easily see this information, there's no incentive for the brain remembering the information. It's similar to what happens when you Google every single information. Your brain stops learning, it stops memorizing, it stops recalling information, because everything can be Googled. There is no incentive for the brain to recall information sufficiently. Do you get it? When you Google everything, there is no incentive for the brain to recall information. Similarly, when you highlight everything, everything loses importance. So nothing is important anymore. If you highlight one word, one phrase here and there, there's no problems with that at all. But excessive highlighting is probably not a good way to go. Instead of highlighting, what should you do? Annotate as effectively as possible. Highlighting may make your notes look beautiful. I'm sure if you go online, you're going to see a lot of highlighted, beautiful notes. Sometimes I'm like, wow, beautiful notes. But annotation will make your brain happy. and beautiful as well. If you annotate, you are putting down information that is relevant and that makes the information in your first aid or whatever book you're annotating in more relevant as well. For example, you have studied the first aid and you are now doing U-World questions. When you practice U-World questions, you can take information from U-World that was not in your first aid and put it in your first aid in a very brief, easy to understand format. What this does is basically add value to the information in your first aid, make your first aid more comprehensive. And I usually recommend that you annotate in one material. So if you're using the first aid, for example, and you're studying U-World and you have Amboss or whatever, and you have a video resource, you want to annotate in one of these books so that it's going to be very easy for you to collect all your information in one place. You have one book that you can carry around with you and you could say, okay, this is my study material. This book contains every information I need to pass the USMLE. I used to have one first aid from all the way back. I've given out that first aid now. But that first aid contained everything I needed. Everything I had studied, both in the first aid, in the Robbins textbook, from my video lectures, and everything. Everything basically that was in my brain was inside that note. You can turn your first aid to that kind of material. And what's the best way to do that is basically to annotate efficiently. Again, highlighting may make your notes look beautiful, but annotation would make your brain happy. Finally, this is the last point. There are a lot of persons that will tell you, take as long as it takes to prepare for the exam. Now, if there is no time frame for, on your exam, if you don't know when you will write the exam, you will probably never be ready for the exam. There are a lot of students that say, oh, it took me 1 year, it took me 2 years, it took me 3 years. Some people have taken over 5 years preparing for the USMLE. It doesn't have to take that long to prepare for the exam. And the way to make that happen is to put a cap on the timeline for when you're going to write your exam. I'm going to write my exam in November. I'm going to write this exam in April. So between now and April, I have 8 months. What do? I'm going to make a schedule that runs for 6 months. Okay, in the next 6 months, I'm going to finish everything studying. For the last 2 months, I'm going to be taking self-assessments and testing myself and doing corrections and testing myself and doing corrections. In April, in November, at this time, probably on this date, I will write my exam. If you don't have a time frame for when you need to write, or when you have to even write your exam, you may never be ready for the exam. You may always procrastinate. You may give reasons. You may find reasons, and there are a lot of legitimate reasons why you shouldn't be ready for your exam at a particular time. But until you put a cap on the time frame you have for your exams, then you will just not be ready for the exam. Best practice, set a time frame, set a timetable, get a schedule that works, an effective schedule, and begin to prepare for your exam. And that brings us to the end of this video. Again, common practices versus best practices. Reading and rereading is probably not a good idea. Instead, practice spaced repetition. Reading the first aid 5 times, 10 times is probably not a good idea. Instead, finish multiple question banks. Highlighting with a paintbrush is probably not a good idea. Instead, practice more annotation. Taking as long as forever to prepare for the examination is probably also not a good idea. And in fact, sometimes when you take too long, information decay begins to occur. You begin to forget basic things. You begin to get confused. You begin to get frustrated. You begin to feel depressed because life happens. Life happens, right? So it's better instead to set a time frame that works, stick with it, and make it happen. Thanks once again for viewing this video. Again, if you've not subscribed, please subscribe down below. If you want to see more information, more posts, I talk about all of these things over on Instagram. So go to Study with Kennedy on Instagram, and I would see you guys there.